On a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1962, a 30-year-old farmer named Earl Dunlap walked into the First National Bank of Custer County, Nebraska, and did something that would make him a legend. He refused to sign a contract. The banker's name was Harold Vance. He'd been running the agricultural lending desk for 15 years, and he'd seen every kind of farmer walk through his door. Desperate ones, proud ones, foolish ones, smart ones. He thought he'd seen everything. He'd never seen anything like Earl Dunlap. Mr. Dunlap, the terms are standard. 5-year loan, variable interest, secured against your property. Everyone signs this contract. It's how banking works. Earl looked at the papers spread across Harold's desk. 8 pages of small print, legal language, clauses and subclauses that would take a lawyer to understand. What's this part here? Earl pointed to a paragraph on page 4. That's the adjustment clause. It allows us to modify the interest rate based on market conditions. Modify it up or down, depending on circumstances. So I could sign this today at 6%, and tomorrow you could make it 12%. Harold smiled the patient smile of a man explaining simple things to simple people. That's not how it works in practice, Mr. Dunlap. We're not in the business of surprising our customers, but you could, according to this paper. Technically, yes, but, and this part here. Earl flipped to page 6. This says you can demand full payment at any time if you determine the loan is at risk. Who determines what at risk means? The bank makes that determination based on whatever you decide. Harold's smile was starting to strain. Mr. Dunlap, these are standard terms. Every farmer in this county has signed this exact contract. If you want the loan, you sign the papers. That's how it works. Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed the contract back across the desk. No. Harold blinked. No, I'm not signing this. I'll take the loan on a handshake. You give me the money, I pay it back with interest. We shake hands on it. No paper. Harold stared at Earl like he'd just suggested they conduct their business in Martian. A handshake. You want a handshake loan? That's right. Mr. Dunlap, this is 1962. We don't do handshake deals anymore. That's how business was done in your grandfather's time. The modern world runs on contracts. My grandfather's way worked fine for him. Your grandfather didn't need to borrow $10,000 for a new tractor. Then I'll buy a used one. Earl stood up. Thank you for your time, Mr. Vance. He was halfway to the door when Harold started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, a real laugh, the kind that comes from genuine disbelief. Harold leaned back in his chair and laughed until tears formed in his eyes. A handshake? He wants a handshake. Harold called out to his assistant in the next room. Dorothy, come in here. You have to hear this. Mr. Dunlap here wants to do business like it's 8. Earl stopped at the door. He turned and looked at the banker, at the laughing face and the shaking shoulders and the tears of amusement. Are you done, Mr. Vance? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Harold wiped his eyes. It's just a handshake. In 1962, you might as well ask to pay in chickens. He laughed again. Mr. Dunlap, you're never going to get credit anywhere in this county with that attitude. No bank, no dealer, no supplier is going to do business with a man who won't sign a contract. You're going to learn that the hard way. Earl nodded slowly. Maybe so. We'll see who learns what. He walked out of the bank and didn't look back. Let me tell you about Earl Dunlap's grandfather, because that's where this story really begins. Earl's grandfather, Silas Dunlap, came to Nebraska in 18. He homesteaded 160 acres in Custer County, built a sod house with his own hands, and started farming the same year. He had nothing, no money, no equipment, no help, just his hands and his word. In those days, business was done differently. A man's word was his bond. When Silas needed seed, he shook hands with the merchant and promised to pay after harvest. When he needed a mule, he shook hands with the rancher and worked off the debt over the winter. Everything was personal. Everything was witnessed. Everything was based on trust. Silas did well. He expanded to 320 acres, built a real house, raised a family. He never signed a contract in his life, never needed to. His handshake was worth more than any piece of paper. Then came the Great Depression hit Nebraska like a hammer. Crop prices collapsed. Banks started failing. And suddenly, all those contracts that farmers had signed without reading, contracts with adjustment clauses and demand clauses and fine print that nobody understood, those contracts became weapons. Silas Dunlap didn't have any contracts. He'd done business the old way, handshakes and witnesses and a man's word. When the banks collapsed, he had nothing to fear from them. He owed some money to neighbors, sure, but those debts were personal, renegotiable, human. His neighbors weren't so lucky. Silas watched families who'd farmed beside him for decades lose everything, not because they couldn't pay. They could have, eventually, if given time, but because the contracts they'd signed gave the banks the right to demand immediate payment, to seize property, to destroy lives with a stroke of a pen. Never sign a contract, Silas told his grandson, 8-year-old Earl, in the winter of 19. They were sitting on the porch, watching the snow fall on fields that Silas still owned, fields that his neighbors had lost. Why not, Grandpa? Because a contract isn't an agreement, boy. It's a trap. A handshake is between two men who trust each other. A contract is between two men who don't trust each other, and the one with the better lawyer wins. But what if someone cheats you? Someone might cheat you anyway, contract or no contract. The difference is, with a handshake, you know who you're dealing with. You can look a man in the eye and judge his character. With a contract, you're dealing with paper, and paper doesn't have character. Paper just has lawyers. Earl never forgot that conversation. Now let me tell you about the John Deere dealer, because Harold Vance wasn't the only one who laughed. After the bank incident, Earl drove to Peterson Equipment on the edge of town. He needed a tractor. His old farmall was dying, and he couldn't afford to keep nursing it through another season. The dealer, Roy Peterson, was happy to see him. Earl Dunlap was known as a hard worker and an honest man. His credit should be good.
Earl, good to see you. Looking at that new 401? She's a beauty.
She is. What would you need to make a deal? Well, we've got financing through John Deere Credit. Just sign the paperwork and you can drive her home today. What if I don't want to sign paperwork? Roy's smile flickered. What do you mean? I mean, I'll pay you in full, cash, over 3 years, but I won't sign a contract. We shake hands on the deal, get some witnesses, and that's it. Roy laughed. Not as hard as Harold Vance, but the same kind of laugh. The laugh of a man who thinks he's hearing a joke. Earl, that's not how it works. We need documentation, signatures, legal protection. Protection for who? For both of us. Seems to me the protection is mostly for you. If I don't pay, you've got a piece of paper that says you can take my farm. If you sell me a lemon, I've got what? A piece of paper that says I agreed to whatever you put in the fine print. Roy's smile faded. Earl, I can't sell you a tractor without a signed contract. That's company policy. Then I'll buy a used one somewhere else. Good luck finding someone who'll sell to you without papers. Earl nodded. I'll manage. He drove home that day without a new tractor. He nursed his old farm all through another season, and another, and another. He bought equipment when he could find sellers who'd accept a handshake, usually older farmers like himself, men who remembered the old ways. It was harder. It was slower. It limited his options. But Earl Dunlap never signed a contract. Let me tell you about the notebook, because that's where Earl's protection came from. If you're going to do business on handshakes, you need records. Earl understood that, so he kept a notebook, a plain black composition book that he bought at the general store for 15 cents. Every time he made a deal, he wrote it down. The date, the terms, the names of the witnesses. He'd read the entry out loud to everyone present, make sure they agreed it was accurate, and then have the witnesses sign beneath his own signature. It wasn't a contract. It was a record of what had been agreed. By 1984, Earl had filled 7 notebooks, 22 years of handshake deals, all documented in his careful handwriting. Equipment purchases, seed sales, cattle trades, small loans from neighbors, everything. His wife, Margaret, kept the notebooks in a fireproof box in the kitchen. "If the house burns down," she said once, "these books are coming with me." "They're just records," Earl said. "They're your whole life, Earl. Every deal, every promise, every handshake. These books are worth more than the farm." She was right. She just didn't know how right until 1984. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever refused to do something that everyone else was doing because something in your gut told you it was wrong? Have you ever been laughed at for following your instincts instead of following the crowd? That's what Earl Dunlap lived with for 22 years. Every time he went to town, someone made a joke about Handshake Earl. Every time he tried to do business, he faced the same condescending smiles, the same patient explanations about how the modern world worked. He could have given in. It would have been easier. Sign the papers, get the credit, grow the farm the way everyone else was growing. But every time he thought about signing, he remembered his grandfather on that porch in 1940, watching the snow fall on fields he still owned while his neighbors' farms went to auction. A contract isn't an agreement, it's a trap. Earl kept his pen in his pocket. Let me tell you about 1984, because that's when the trap sprung on everyone else. The farm crisis didn't happen overnight. It built slowly. Through the late 70s and early 80s, interest rates climbing, land values peaking and then falling, commodity prices dropping. By 1984, the disaster was undeniable. Farmers who had borrowed to expand in the good years suddenly owed more than their land was worth. And those contracts they'd signed, the ones with the adjustment clauses and the demand clauses and all that fine print, those contracts were being used against them. Interest rates that had been 8% were now 18%. Loans that had been manageable were now impossible. And buried in those contracts were clauses that let the banks call in the full balance at any time, for any reason, if they decided the loan was at risk. Every farmer was at risk in 1984, which meant every farmer was at the mercy of their bank. The foreclosures started in the spring. Farms that had been in families for generations sold at auction for a fraction of their value. Men who had worked the land their whole lives, suddenly homeless. The county newspaper ran foreclosure notices every week, page after page of dreams dying. Earl Dunlap watched it happen. He knew most of these families. He'd grown up with their children, worked beside them, shared equipment and labor. Good people, hard workers, destroyed not by laziness or stupidity, but by contracts they'd never fully understood. And then, in July of 1984, the bank came for Earl. Let me tell you about Harold Vance's successor, because Harold had retired in The new head of agricultural lending was a man named Dennis Roth, younger, sharper, more aggressive. He'd been brought in from Omaha to optimize the bank's loan portfolio, which meant squeezing every farmer who owed money. Dennis had reviewed all the accounts, and he'd found something interesting about Earl Dunlap. According to the records, Earl had a loan, a $5,000 operating loan that he'd taken out in 1979 to buy seed after a bad harvest. The interest rate had been 7% when he signed, except Earl hadn't signed. Dennis didn't know that. The records showed a loan, an amount, an interest rate. Someone had entered it into the system years ago, probably a teller, who assumed that of course there was a signed contract somewhere. There wasn't. Earl had made that deal with a handshake, witnessed by two neighbors, recorded in his notebook. The bank had given him the money based on his reputation and his word. No paper. But Dennis Roth didn't know about handshakes and notebooks. He just knew that Earl Dunlap owed $5,000, plus interest, plus the adjustment clauses that had raised the rate to 16%, plus the penalties for being in a high-risk zone. By Dennis's calculations, Earl owed almost $9,000, and Dennis wanted it now. The letter arrived on a Saturday morning in July. Dear Mr. Dunlap, your loan of $5,000, originated in 1979, is hereby called in full per Section 7C of your loan agreement. The current balance, including accrued interest and applicable fees, is $8,847.53. Payment is due within 30 days. Failure to pay will result in foreclosure proceedings. Earl read the letter twice. Then he started to laugh. Margaret looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Earl, what's funny about a foreclosure notice? They think I signed a contract." "What?" "Look at this. Per Section 7C of your loan agreement. There is no loan agreement. There's no Section 7. There's no paper at all." Earl held up the letter. "They're trying to foreclose on me based on a contract that doesn't exist. But you did borrow that money. I remember." "I did. Handshake deal with old Harold Vance before he retired. Lloyd Morrison and Pete Simmons witnessed it. It's in the book." Earl went to the fireproof box and pulled out the notebook from 9. He flipped to the right page and read aloud. "July 14, 1979, borrowed $5,000 from First National Bank of Custer County for seed purchase. Terms, repay principal, plus 7% simple interest over 5 years. No penalties, no adjustment clauses, no acceleration. Witnessed by Lloyd Morrison and Pete Simmons. Signed Earl Dunlap." He showed Margaret the page. Below his neat handwriting were the signatures of the 2 witnesses. "They can't foreclose on a handshake deal," Earl said. "There's nothing to foreclose. No contract, no collateral agreement, no lien on the property. They gave me $5,000 based on my word, and I've been paying it back according to our agreement." "But have you paid it all?" "Almost. I've got about $2,000 left, at 7% simple interest, not $9,000 at 16%. They can't change terms that were never written down." Margaret looked at the letter, then at the notebook, then at her husband. "What are you going to do?" Earl smiled. "I'm going to go see Mr. Roth, and I'm bringing the book. Let me tell you about the meeting at the bank, because that's where Dennis Roth learned about handshakes." Earl walked into First National on Monday morning wearing his Sunday suit and carrying the black notebook. He asked to see Dennis Roth. The secretary looked surprised. Usually, farmers who got foreclosure notices didn't come in looking calm and confident. Dennis was surprised too, but he covered it with professional smoothness. "Mr. Dunlap, I assume you're here about the letter." "I am. Have you arranged payment? We can discuss an extension if—" "I'm not here to discuss payment, Mr. Roth. I'm here to tell you that your letter is wrong." Dennis's eyebrows rose. "Wrong? You're trying to foreclose on a loan that doesn't have a contract. You're citing sections of an agreement that doesn't exist. You're calculating interest based on adjustment clauses that were never part of our deal. Mr. Dunlap, I have your loan file right here. Originated in 1979, $5,000, variable interest. Show me the contract." Dennis blinked. What? "The contract. The paper I signed. Show it to me." Dennis opened the file folder on his desk and started flipping through papers. Account statements, interest calculations, internal memos. He flipped faster, his confidence starting to waver. "It should be here. The original agreement, it's not there, Mr. Roth, because it doesn't exist. That loan was made on a handshake." Dennis looked up. "A handshake? Harold Vance and I shook hands on $5,000 at 7% simple interest, to be repaid over 5 years. Lloyd Morrison and Pete Simmons witnessed the agreement. It's all recorded here." Earl held up the notebook. "Page 47. Would you like to see it?" "Mr. Dunlap, that's not how banking works. We can't make loans without signed contracts. There must be documentation somewhere." "There isn't. I've never signed a contract in my life. Ask anyone in this county. Ask Harold Vance himself if you don't believe me." Dennis sat back in his chair, the color draining from his face. He was starting to understand the size of the problem. If there's no contract, then there's no adjustment clause, no acceleration clause, no way to foreclose. Earl's voice was calm but firm. "I owe you about $2,000, Mr. Roth. 7% simple interest on a 5-year loan, paid down over the past 5 years, not $9,000 at 16%. And there's no legal mechanism to demand immediate payment because there's no contract that gives you that right. This is This is highly irregular. It's how business used to be done. Before all those clauses and conditions and fine print that you use to trap people. Earl leaned forward. Let me tell you something, Mr. Roth. Right now, you're foreclosing on farms all over this county. Good people, hard workers, losing everything because of papers they signed without understanding. Papers with adjustment clauses that let you double their interest rates. Papers with acceleration clauses that let you demand immediate payment. Those are standard terms. They're traps, and I refuse to walk into them. Earl stood up. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to continue paying off my loan at the original terms, 7% simple interest, the way Harold and I agreed. You're going to accept those payments because you have no legal basis to demand anything else. And if you try to foreclose on me, I'll see you in court with my notebook, my witnesses, and a judge who'll be very interested in how your bank does business. Dennis opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Earl walked to the door, then stopped and turned back. One more thing, Mr. Roth. 22 years ago, Harold Vance laughed at me for wanting to do business with a handshake. He said I'd never get credit, never grow, never succeed. You might want to ask him how that prediction worked out. He walked out of the bank, leaving Dennis Roth staring at an empty loan file and a very large problem. Let me tell you about the lawsuit, because the bank didn't give up that easily. Dennis Roth was embarrassed, but he was also stubborn. He consulted with the bank's lawyers, who consulted with other lawyers, and eventually they decided to test Earl's handshake defense in court. The argument was simple. In the modern banking system, verbal agreements weren't legally binding for loans over a certain amount. Nebraska's statute of frauds required written contracts for any agreement involving significant sums. A handshake, no matter how many witnesses, wasn't a valid loan agreement. Therefore, the bank argued, there was no loan at all. Earl had received $5,000 from the bank without a valid contract. That made it either a gift, which the bank certainly hadn't intended, or fraud, which would let them pursue criminal charges. Earl hired a lawyer, old Tom Hendricks, who'd been practicing in Custer County for 40 years. Tom read the bank's brief and started to chuckle. They're trying to say the loan doesn't exist because you didn't sign papers, that's their argument. And they want the money back because there's no contract? Plus interest and penalties. Tom laughed out loud. Earl, they've outsmarted themselves. If there's no valid contract, then there's no valid interest rate, no valid penalty, no valid anything. They can ask for the principal back, maybe, but that's it. And even that's questionable, because they gave you the money voluntarily, knowing exactly what kind of deal they were making. So I'll win, you'll win, and when you do, every farmer in this county who's being squeezed by those adjustment clauses is going to start asking questions about whether their contracts are really as ironclad as the bank claims. The case went to trial in October of 19... Earl sat in the courtroom with his 7 notebooks stacked on the table in front of him. 22 years of handshake deals, all documented. Lloyd Morrison testified. Pete Simmons testified. Harold Vance, pulled out of retirement, testified that yes, he had made a handshake loan to Earl Dunlap in 1979, and yes, the terms were exactly as Earl had recorded them in his notebook. Why did you make a loan without a contract? The bank's lawyer asked Harold. Because Earl Dunlap was good for it, Harold said simply. Because his word was better than most men's signatures. Because that's how banking used to work, before we decided that paper was more important than people. The judge ruled in Earl's favor. The written opinion was 12 pages long, but the key paragraph said everything. The bank voluntarily entered into an agreement with Mr. Dunlap, knowing that he refused to sign contracts, and conducted business through verbal agreements with witnesses. They accepted this arrangement for 5 years, collecting payments according to the terms Mr. Dunlap recorded in his notebook. They cannot now claim that the agreement was invalid simply because they wish to impose harsher terms. A handshake deal, properly witnessed and documented, is as binding as any written contract, and unlike many written contracts, it contains no hidden clauses to surprise the parties later. Earl Dunlap walked out of the courthouse a free man. His farm was safe, his debt was settled, and 22 years of being called crazy had finally paid off. Let me tell you about what happened next, because Earl's victory wasn't just about one farm. The ruling made news, not national news. This was Nebraska in 1984, and there were bigger stories, but local news, regional news, farm community news. Word spread about the farmer who beat the bank with nothing but a notebook and a handshake. Other farmers started asking questions. If Earl's handshake deal was valid, what about the contracts we signed? Are those adjustment clauses really enforceable? Can the bank really change our interest rates whenever they want? Lawyers started looking at those contracts more carefully. They found problems, clauses that were buried in fine print, terms that contradicted each other, language that was so complicated that no ordinary person could understand it. Some farmers won their cases, others reached settlements. The banks, facing increasing scrutiny, became less aggressive about foreclosures. Not kind, not generous, but careful. And through it all, Earl Dunlap's name kept coming up. The handshake farmer, the man who refused to sign, the man who was right. Farmers started showing up at Earl's kitchen table, asking for advice. How did he structure his deals? How did he keep his records? How did he find people willing to do business without contracts? Earl taught them. He showed them his notebooks, explained his system, introduced them to suppliers and dealers who'd work with handshakes. He wasn't trying to start a movement. He was just sharing what he knew. But it became a movement anyway. By 1990, there were dozens of farmers in the region who'd adopted some version of Earl's approach. Not complete rejection of contracts. That was too radical for most people, but careful scrutiny, negotiation, refusal to sign anything they didn't fully understand. Read before you sign, Earl would say. And if you can't understand it, don't sign it. Shake hands instead. At least then you know what you're agreeing to. Let me tell you about the plaque, because that's how Earl's story ends. In 2002, the Nebraska Farm Bureau honored Earl Dunlap with a Lifetime Achievement Award. They held the ceremony at the county fairgrounds, and half the farming community showed up. Earl, 70 years old now, and still working his land, stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd. Farmers and bankers, lawyers and merchants, 3 generations of people whose lives had been shaped by the farm crisis of the 1980s. "I'm not much for speeches," he started, and everyone laughed. Earl Dunlap's dislike of formal ceremonies was almost as legendary as his dislike of contracts. "But I want to say something about handshakes." The crowd went quiet. "In 1962, I decided I wasn't going to sign contracts anymore. The banker laughed at me. The equipment dealer laughed at me. Everybody thought I was crazy, and for 22 years I lived with that. The jokes, the limitations, the constant reminders that the modern world didn't work the way I worked." Earl paused. Then 1984 came, and suddenly all those contracts that people had signed, all that fine print they hadn't read, all those clauses they hadn't understood, it all came due. Farms that had been in families for generations, gone. Good people destroyed not by drought or disease, but by paper, by words they'd agreed to without knowing what they meant. He held up one of his notebooks. "I survived because of these 7 books of handshake deals, all witnessed, all documented, all honest. No hidden clauses, no surprise terms, just 2 people agreeing to something and meaning it." Earl looked at the notebook in his hands. "My grandfather told me that a contract is a trap and a handshake is a promise." He was right. But here's what I've learned. It's not really about handshakes versus contracts. It's about trust versus trickery. It's about honest dealing versus fine print. It's about looking a man in the eye and knowing that he means what he says. He set the notebook down. "You don't have to do business my way, but whatever way you choose, do it honestly. Read what you sign, understand what you agree to, and never ever trust anyone who needs 100 pages of legal language to make a simple deal. That's not business. That's a trap." Earl stepped back from the podium. The crowd was silent for a moment. Then the applause started. It built slowly, from the front rows where the old farmers sat, spreading back through the crowd until everyone was on their feet. Farmers who'd lost their land and farmers who'd kept it. Bankers who'd foreclosed and bankers who'd negotiated. All of them applauding the stubborn man who'd refused to sign, who'd been laughed at for decades, who'd been right all along. Earl Dunlap died in 2015, at the age of 83. He was still farming until the last year of his life, still doing business with handshakes, still keeping his records in those black composition books. His grandson, James, took over the farm. The first thing he did was go to the fireproof box in the kitchen and pull out the notebooks. 8 of them now. The 8th one started by Earl in "What are you going to do with those?" James's wife asked. "Same thing Grandpa did. Keep records, get witnesses, do business honestly. But nobody does handshake deals anymore." James smiled. "Then I'll be the only one. Wouldn't be the first Dunlap to stand alone." The farm is still operating today. 3 generations of Dunlaps, 3 generations of handshakes, 3 generations of that same stubborn refusal to sign what they don't understand. And in the kitchen drawer next to the refrigerator there's a fireproof box. Inside are 8 black notebooks, 22 years of being laughed at, 40 years of being proven right. That's the power of a handshake. That's the legacy of Earl Dunlap. That's what happens when you trust your grandfather.